Now, the advantage of creating a formal data source, as we've done here, is that we now have a persistent connection to our database. What this means is that I can build other assets, as I mentioned, data worksheets, reports, dashboards, on this data source. And when the data in the database changes, for example, if new records are added to the database or old records are deleted from the database, because this is a persistent connection to that database, all of my reports and all of my dashboards and my worksheets will all be automatically updated with the new information. So this data source that we've defined here is basically a conduit to the contents of our database, whatever those contents happen to be at any time. Now, in some cases, you would like to be able to use data, for example, in a dashboard or in a report, but you don't really need to set up a formal data source like we've done here. That might be because you simply don't need a persistent connection. In other words, you want to import the data once. Perhaps it's data that you have in an Excel file or in a text file, and you just want to get access to that data. You never really expect that data to be changing on an ongoing basis, so there's no real advantage to setting up a formal data source connection to that data. In that case, what you can do is simply import that data into a data worksheet, and that's a quick and easy way to get access to your data without setting up a formal data source. So let's illustrate how we can do that. Simply import data from an Excel file. Let's close this data source simply by clicking on the X at the top. If you want, you can leave it open. We can have multiple tabs open in Style Studio, but to avoid the clutter, we'll just close it. You can see that it is still saved. There's the sample orders data source, so it's there when we need it. And if you want to reopen it at some later point, simply double-click, and that will reopen the data source information. But for now, we'll close it, and let's open a new data worksheet. If you want to import data from a text file or Excel file, what you'll do is you'll import that data into a data worksheet. So press the New button in Style Studio, and in the left panel, select Worksheet. And there's nothing to select in the right panel, so click OK. And that opens a new worksheet. If there's not enough room for you to see the grid, enough of the grid, you can close the Explorer panel on the right side by pressing the little X in that panel, and now we can see a bit more of the worksheet grid. Now, what we'll see later on is that a worksheet is a very powerful tool for doing manipulations on data, and those manipulations can include joining together different tables, joining together different data sources, filtering, grouping, and a lot of other operations. But for now, we just want to take advantage of one feature here, which is the ability of the data worksheet to import data from an Excel file or a text file. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we need to do is to create an embedded table. And we do that by pressing the Embedded Table button in the toolbar. Click on the Embedded Table button, and then that gives turns the cursor into a crosshair. And with the crosshair cursor, simply drag on the grid to select a certain number of cells. Doesn't matter how many rows or columns you select, and I'll explain why in a moment. So just select some rows and columns, and that creates an embedded table. Now, an embedded table is a method for manually entering data into a data worksheet. These cells are all editable in this table, and so if you want, you can type values into these cells. But our intention in this case is to import data into this embedded table. The reason why it doesn't matter how many rows and columns we use is because when you import data from a data file, a text file or Excel file or comma-separated value file, the table will automatically adapt to the number of rows and columns that are in that data file. So we don't need to worry about the rows and columns at this point. Instead, let's go ahead and import our data. So right-click on the title bar of this table and select the option Import Data File. That opens a dialog box called Import Data File. And here we can select the file that we want to import, press the Select File button, and what we're going to do is navigate to a particular location find the installation of your style intelligence evaluation version. So in my case, that's at my root C drive. I'll find this style intelligence evaluation. And in there, we're going to look for the examples folder, and then the doc examples, and then data source, and then finally data. Okay, so the full path that I followed is from the style intelligence root installation, examples, doc examples, data source, and data. And in there, you'll find a data source called order data text. And this is basically just some of the same data that we have from our other orders data source, the one that we just set up a connection to. It's essentially the same data, but converted into a text format. So this is intended to simulate the case where you have some data in a text file or Excel file that you need to import and use in reports and dashboards, etc. So select that file, press open. Because this is an Excel file, an XLS file, we have the opportunity to select the sheet of the file, of the Excel spreadsheet that we want to import. In this case, there is only one sheet, so there's nothing to select there. The rest of these options allow you to tailor the import to the particular type of file that you're using. If it's a pivoted file, you can unpivot it by specifying the number of header columns. You can specify, if it's a text file, the CSV file, the delimiter, and whether it's a tab delimiter. You can specify if you want to automatically remove quotation marks, and so on. For this particular example, we don't need to make any changes at all. These settings are fine. And so simply go ahead and press the upload button, and the data file is then imported into this embedded table. And you can see that the number of columns in the table adapts automatically to the number of columns that are in that Excel file. The data that we're seeing here is not all of the data. If you want to see more data, you can drag the bottom border of the table down like this, and that will allow you to expand the table so that you can see more records. As it turns out, there are more records here than you can actually fit on a single screen, but there is a scroll bar, so you can scroll through the records. And this allows us to see the actual data. In some cases, this view of the data may be truncated. This view is called the live data view. And in some cases, it may be truncated to only a certain number of records. But if you want to see the full number of records in the table, what you can do is right-click on the table title bar and select Preview. And the Preview feature will open a new tab in Style Studio, and that will give you the full display of all the records. So if you ever want to be certain that you're looking at all of the records in a table, you can preview the table, and the preview will show you all of the records. I'm going to close the Preview tab and return to our design view. Let's go ahead now and give this table a name. You'll notice that it has a default name of Query 1. We can probably think of a slightly better name for this. So right-click on the table and select Properties. And in place of the name Query 1, we'll change the name to Order Data. There are other settings we can set here that restrict the number of rows, etc., but all we need to change right now is simply the name. Press OK, and that changes the name of this table. This kind of table, we'll find out later, is also called a data block, and later on we'll discuss the reasons why we call this kind of table a data block. But let's go ahead and save the data worksheet now, which contains this single table or data block. Press the Save button in the toolbar. And we're going to save this under the name Excel Order Data Worksheet. Excel Order Data Worksheet, and we can save that at the root level. So simply make sure that the root level worksheet is selected. When we save a worksheet, this gets saved into a file called asset.dat. And that file is in the current working repository. So again, this is one reason why we need to verify what the current working repository is, because we want to know exactly where these assets are being saved. This particular asset, this particular data worksheet, is being saved into the current working repository for Style Studio. Then press OK. And now this data worksheet is saved, and we can use this data worksheet now as a data source for reports and for dashboards. Now, we should point out again the important difference between creating a data source this way versus creating a formal data source as we did before. Remember, under the Asset tab, if we look under the data sources, we set up this formal sample orders data source. This data source. The difference between doing this and between simply importing data into a data worksheet is, again, that the formal data source is a persistent connection to that database, meaning that when the database data changes, any reports and any dashboards that utilize this connection, that utilize this data source, will be automatically updated with the new data. That is not true for reports and dashboards that use this data worksheet. Because we've imported this data into the data worksheet, the data will now always be as you see it here. Right? This is essentially a one-time import, and any reports and any dashboards that use this data worksheet will be using this very data as you see it. If somebody in the future changes that Excel file by adding data, by removing data, that will have no effect at all on this data worksheet. And if in fact you learn that that Excel file has been modified and you want therefore to modify the data worksheet with the new data, then what you would need to do is manually repeat the process of importing the data. And we know how to do that. You would right-click, select Import Data File, and repeat the exact process that we just went through to import the updated data into the data worksheet. So that is a very significant difference between importing data into a data worksheet and setting up a formal data source. In general, when you want to connect to a database which will be undergoing changes, right, whether it's an order database or other information that might be changing on an ongoing basis, in general, you should set up a formal connection, formal data source connection to that database so that those changes will always be reflected in other assets that you create. Okay, well, having finished the creation of this data worksheet, we can close this tab and close the other tab.